Welcome everyone to the CIAC meeting. We've got a jam-packed agenda today. So as always, we definitely want to have plenty of dialogue. And if we run out of time, we can always come back and finish things. So I don't want to put too much on everybody's plate so that we can't really have robust conversations. So we'll just take it as we can. And we have two big topics, project delivery overview and kind of look back, look forward challenges, and then our funding challenges, another big topic, look back, look forward, and really looking for help in how we can get the message out to folks in a way that is meaningful and understandable. And then to the extent we have time, we'll do a recap at the end. So we have a break next month. We're not going to have a meeting in April, and then we will resume again in May. So let's just get started. And I'm going to turn it over to Mac and Tova for project delivery overview.
Good. Thank you, Commissioner. So yeah, Tova, it's probably worth you introducing yourself for this group.
Sure. Can y'all hear me okay? I was having some audio.
Yes.
Cool. All right. My name is Tova Peltz, and I am Mac's Deputy Division Administrator for Delivery and Operations at ODOT. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for your time today.
That's good to see all of you again. So I think, tables reversed. Now I'm presenting to the group. Normally, I think Mayor Cross, you saw me sitting on the other side last time. So to Commissioner Smith's comments, right, really looking for the dialogue here today. So we've got a number of slides we recently presented to the Transportation Commission. So last Thursday, oh my goodness, was that just last Thursday, Commissioner?
Yeah, seems like a lot's happened since then.
It's been busy. So we've got a bit of a truncated version of this same presentation, one to get set some context for the CIAC, but really we're going to pivot this conversation to, in my mind, what's the role of the CIAC moving forward in this project delivery space when we think about our portfolio. So really am looking for feedback. If we can go to the next slide, please, Michaela. So we want to share some observations and analysis of our portfolio of projects that we've delivered over the last 4 years, some things that we are already taking to make some improvements, and then more importantly, for this group, I think, discuss the role the CIAC can have and play moving forward. I think there was certainly some envision of this coming out of House Bill 2017 when the CIAC was created. I think for context with this group, Paula and Ted and Shauna, certainly you'll recall our conversations around cost estimating last year, our conversation around storytelling, and then of course, Mayor Cross, you were on last time when we talked about our dashboard. So all those things I think are fitting into now how do we take it to the next level in terms of project delivery, accountability, performance of our entire portfolio. So I think it's a building of those conversations over the last couple of years with CIAC in my mind. One thing I just want to call out, we've talked around this group around cost estimating in the past. In my mind, more like how do we build the cost estimate for a construction project? We're really, and we'll get into it here in a minute, we're really taking a much broader view of this discussion to say, how are we building the entire portfolio of projects that may be several years out in advance in terms of what estimates are we using when we haven't done any design yet, right? It's really at a very high level conceptual place, but that's what the public's expecting of us. And I think we'll share a little bit more of our observations and some thoughts we have about how we take this in a different direction. But definitely looking for some feedback from CIAC as we go here. So next slide, Michaela. So I think context setting, we know project delivery is a significant portion of the agency's portfolio. So it represents about half of our budget. And certainly it's a tremendous amount of our visible work within the public, right, is making the improvements to the system. We've spent the last 4 months, Tova and myself and our team, digging into kind of what is our portfolio and how are we executing on all the projects, and what's our health, if you will, a little bit of a health check. And we know we've had significant challenges, not only in the risks playing out over the last couple of years from the pandemic and super high inflation and all of those things, but we also have some things that we've certainly identified that we need to work on in terms of our contract management practices and how we're managing that risk through an entire portfolio of projects. So not just one project at a time, but looking at the whole portfolio. So that's a bit of just context setting for this discussion. Next slide. So here's what we're going to walk through real quick, and this will be fairly brief to Commissioner Smith's point when I get to the dialogue. So I want to share a little bit of data with you all on just how are we doing on time, on budget. We hear those terms a lot, but how we define those are really important, and we're talking about redefining those in a different way moving forward. Our own assessment on where are we missing the mark, our commitments to make some improvements on our delivery. We know we've got some room to improve, and I think we certainly heard that from the commission last week, acknowledgement of us taking these steps, and owning the fact that we're a little late, and I think recognizing that, and that's on us. So here we are today talking about how we're making those changes. And then what can we expect over the next few months as we're making some changes? Certainly the dashboard coming out in our conversation last time feeds into this. What is our public messaging on it? And then finally, we'll get to kind of how we're thinking as a CIAC of how do we keep this topic front and center moving forward. And in my mind, not a once a year conversation, but what are we doing to keep that continuous improvement momentum, so that we're not doing this, every 4 years in terms of the business cycle. So next slide. So just a couple data points for us. We've got a handful of, well, not a handful, we've got some projects and some notable projects that certainly have some exposure from the costs as well as what funding do we have set aside for them. Candidly, we're experiencing some significant challenges when we think of multi-year construction projects. So think of some of the bigger ones out there through a time of some pretty crazy pretty crazy environment of delivering work, but also just how tooled up are we to deliver those kinds of projects, recognizing, and Tova will speak to that here in a minute, recognizing we do a lot of projects in that $1 to $5 million range, and recognizing the risk is different when you're talking about a big project. Reflections on House Bill 2017, so the last big funding package and what we've delivered through that, but also our performance in delivering. Certainly spoke to what we recognize are some of the challenges and actions we need to take. The commission is certainly paying attention to this and has asked for that work as well. And then certainly trying to, I think, land the mark in our storytelling conversation around what information are we presenting, in what format, and in what way to get that message out there. So next slide. I'm going to just touch on this briefly, and I'll turn it over to Tova to share some of the data. So coming out of House Bill 2017, we did took some major steps. So in 2018, we stood up our statewide project delivery branch, so reorganized the agency. That was before my time in this role. But recognized we needed to take a different approach. And we've had some success with some new tools and processes and approach, and Tova will speak to that here in a minute. We also did some things back in 2019 to establish some new tools and a better discipline of project management. And we unfortunately had to do a STIP rebalance back in 2019. Frankly, we're considering doing the same thing this year of how are we aligning our portfolio of projects to the available funds. So big and important on, I think, Tova and I's part as we're working through this is how do we not recreate this same moment in another 4 or 5 years? And I think for me, that's the connection point to the Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee of where are we keeping this front and center to make sure we are on the right track and not doing a step back and looking at ourselves 4 or 5 years from now. So I'll turn it to Tova. Next slide, walk through a little bit of kind of what have we done, what our outcomes have been, share a little bit of the data, and then we'll circle back up with me to talk about kind of things that are already in motion, what we're thinking about in this space, and then if we haven't got to it yet, we'll start talking, I think, more of the dialogue that's rich for this conversation. So Tova, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Mac. So since 2019, we've put a lot of effort into really developing and supporting the project management discipline across project delivery, and have invested a lot of time into developing tools and resources to support the design phase of advancing projects. And there are a number of tools that we've put into place since 2019, and some of those sort of come online over the last 4 years. There's been more time spent in design, looking at bringing resources in to look at constructability of projects, engaging contractors to make incorporate constructability considerations into our designs. We've been investing in value engineering workshops for projects of certain size, and I think that's something that y'all have been able to see the outcomes on. Same thing with the constructability reviews. We have cost risk assessment tools, and we've been incorporating risk workshops into our projects, and risk the utilization of risk registers through design phase. All of this is happening simultaneous to us putting quite a few new project controls in place, and to track the scope, changes to scope of project, cost to deliver projects, and stage gates through the design phases to track project delivery, project design on schedule. The outcome of all of those project controls in place is that we have so much data about how we're doing delivering projects, really in the design phase, and then to some extent through construction phase. And that has allowed Mac and I and our team to really dig into reflecting on the projects we've delivered since 2019. What's the state of the state of financial health, scope health, risk management health of those projects, because we have all these new tools in place and these controls in place. So we've been able to dig into that data, which has been pretty eye-opening, and also new to us. I think that we've invested a lot into having the data, and this next step is, now that we have all the data, how we're going to use the data to make informed and wiser decisions in the future about how we establish and then manage our portfolio. So I'm going to dig into a little bit what the data is telling us, what we've learned about projects that have completed construction over the last 4 years. So Michaela, next slide. Kind of going back to
before we move off of that, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Could you go back a slide? So, and I think we raised this. I think I raised it maybe in one of the briefings before our last OTC meeting.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important that we unpack the projects delivered on schedule more than 90% of the time, and 90% of the projects are delivered within 10% of the construction contract amount. Unpack it's not the number of the projects, it's the value. So I think if we unpack that and said, okay, of the projects that are, and I don't know what the right break point is, 5 million and below, what's our track record? Of the projects that are 5 to 20, and I'm not sure what the right breakdown is, because my gut is telling me that it's the big projects that we're struggling with. And so we need to know where our weaknesses are and focus on those.
Yep, and I think that's a great point, and definitely something that Mac that Mac and I are thinking about and looking into. And I think that the subsequent slide does break down the portfolio by size of projects to sort of give a better idea of how the portfolio is distributed. But it's also worth noting, you are right on, delivering, if 90% of projects are delivered on budget, but of the 10% that aren't, they account for their mega projects, then being off budget is a much bigger hit and a much bigger risk to the agency, certainly.
Yeah.
And so I think looking at those patterns are really important. I think it's also really important to note that the timelines that we're looking at when we say like on schedule and on budget are really about, like in many cases, the way we're looking at projects based on like how much we've budgeted at construction, like at contract award, rather than going all the way back to like how much did we budget at STIP adoption.
Right.
And that's what we're really digging into, is the like, we do fine when we get I shouldn't say fine. We do better when we're at 100% design. But when we look at like from what I like to say 3% design at STIP adoption to construction completion, we're really missing the mark. And that's where we need to make substantial improvements. And that's what we're going to get into as we kind of walk through these slides a little bit more for this whole group.
Yeah. Before we move on, maybe I think Rod had a comment or a question, and then Paula had her hand up too. So go ahead, Rod.
Mine got answered.
Okay.
Tova indicated that the question I had in my head was coming, so I can wait.
Okay.
I wanted to thank you, Commissioner Smith. You asked the question. And so I'm going to take the advantage here of jumping ahead just a little bit.
Go ahead.
You're absolutely right about, so I'll back up a second. Most of you that work in this field are what I call technical people. So in liberal arts form, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, and you can throw statistics all over the place and they don't tell a story. We have to come up with a way to tell a story and to get better at that story. So for example, a lot of our projects that were over, according to your data here, were bridge projects. I'm curious as to why there isn't, for lack of a better word, a bridge checklist that says we need to know X, Y, Z, Q, PR, all of this when you're making your bid. Because with as many bridges as we've done in the last 10, 15 years, there should be a template of all the things that can go wrong. And so are we making sure that contractors, when they go into this work, know what they've got to budget for? Because that's probably been my biggest question, and it involves me coming out of the whole Highway 20 debacle. Because I was on the ground floor of that way back when, and I watched that thing go absolutely bonkers overnight and turned into, I mean, I'm glad it's done, don't get me wrong, but oh my God, you could have mortgaged the federal government to make that one done. And so one of the questions I'm going to ask you later, and I might as well throw it out there now, we have to be able to hold contractors accountable some way, somehow, whether that's you only get a 5% cap on what you can go over what you bid. You know, it shouldn't be the taxpayer's fault that they don't bid properly. That's because I hear that in my city work, I hear it at the county, and Highway 20, I heard about it every stinking day for years. So just throwing that all out there. And Mac, you are chuckling way too much at what I'm saying.
No.
Mayor.
Yeah, Mayor Cross, I'm not giving light to it. I think it's some of your observations. I mean, every time Piner Mountain comes up, I have to smile because I have to, just so I can sleep at night. But I think your points are well made. And Ted, I saw you come up with your hands. I'll turn to you in just a second. I think one of the things we're struggling a little bit with is, I think to Tova's data, we're doing a decent job when we get into construction with the contractor on what is that price, and are we doing a bunch of change orders because we missed something. And I think we're not seeing it as extensive as maybe what we used to in the past. But I think certainly big projects bring their own sense of exposure. And what we're finding is we've got some what we call multi-construction year projects. So those bigger ones, or we're not anticipating the risk in cost over the duration of a 4-year project right out of the gate. So your comments are just well placed for the challenge I think that we're seeing. And Tova, anything you'd want to add to that before we turn to Ted?
I guess I want to note that what we're sharing today is not intended to like point fingers at anyone but ourselves at like where we're missing the mark. So like when we say that we're encountering cost increases in construction phase for projects, I think that we're really digging into like how where we've missed the mark in our like design and our like development of like bidding materials and in many ways, to Mac's point, how we are taking risks that we know we're carrying into construction and accounting for them in our budget at the front end.
Right.
Because what we're trying to do is not, we want to be in a place where we can deliver projects without needing to add funds along the way. And that means that in a lot of cases, we need to do a better job of quantifying all the risks we know we're carrying through the through the life of the project, and having money and having money set aside to like cover those risks as we encounter them, and identify how we're going to be able to financially address them in the event that those risks come to bear.
So,
and that's something we need to work on as an agency.
Tova, I'm not meaning to point fingers. What I'm driving at is that we have to sell a story, because in this next legislative session, we've got to come up with a better funding thing. And so you have to be able to answer people's concerns. And I think this is a great start. Reading through all of your data, I loved it. But like I said, we've got to be able to tell the correct story out of that so that we can sell that to a legislative body with a whole lot of people that don't trust us. I mean, it's just that simple. And so answering a lot of those questions up front, and I think your data goes a long way to getting that done. But we've got to be ready to answer those complaints with, okay, this is what we've done. We're learning. This is where we see our weaknesses. We're addressing those weaknesses and be able to build on that in a way that they can send out to their constituents.
So if I
Hey,
can,
Tova, I see you're taking lots of good notes. Maybe you could mute while you're typing.
Sorry. Will do. Thank you, Commissioner.
well, Rod, for a guy who didn't want to point fingers, I feel kind of wounded as a bridge contractor. And I can tell you that every bid I put in, I have to have a bond on, and I have to guarantee that I can build for exactly what I bid it for. The problem with bridge work is the foundation work. And we do the best we can as an owner, as ODOT, to determine what the foundation is and to design for that. Now, when you get digging down there or driving pile or drilling shafts or doing many of the things we do, we run into the unknown. And all over this state, it's different 5 miles from the last place, or even 50 feet, it can be different. And so we run into those things, and that's a shared risk between the contractor and the owner. And it's well written out of how that is shared, how it's paid for, and what it's done.
Well, and no, you're absolutely right. But that's what I'm getting at, is that you have to be able to give that part of the story when you're explaining these numbers.
Well, the contractor already does what you're saying you want them to demand they do, and that's pay for what they bid. They do that already, and they're made to. I mean, that's what I've done all my life. But if there's a change, then I look to the owner if it's written that they're responsible to make that change. And that's where our costs go. And it's all in the foundation work. If you take a look at a bridge from once it goes up to the first pier, very little changes. Everything, bridge decks, everything are the same. It's always in the foundation work, but it's there. So if we're really looking to save money, it's not go out and fight with the contractor, but it's partner with them. And Mac, in the early 80s, we had exactly these same meetings talking about how do we lower costs? How do we get things going? How do we get away from big change orders and all the problems? And we were doing the same fighting between the contractor and the owner that's going on right now. And so what we did is we went in and we started on the project having upfront meetings. Really, what are the expectations between the management on the project, on the owner's side and the project. So we had the field people all there that have to work together and have to go through these things. And upper management, we were in there also to make sure it ran in the right direction, that we're in this business together and we want to work it together. And we want to make sure we get the high quality, best project that we can build. And that's what we owe the taxpayers in this state. So right now, what I'm hearing is that it's constant battles on the projects again, that we're into that. And I think it's really, if we want to go save money, we want to get things done on time better, we got to start getting people together and working together and being partners on it. And I'm not saying the state has to give anything away they shouldn't, but if you start the fighting, then contractors bid more because they're going to get beat up by the owner. The owners doesn't look at things because they think the contractor is just out to screw them. And you wind up in this whole battle that just costs the state a hell of a lot more money to build anything.
Well, and
Wind
Ted,
up fights and attorneys and everything else.
there's a way to budget that though, and that maybe that's what we do, is that instead of budgeting X amount on every project, we do that, but you eliminate a couple of projects and you put that into contingency to cover the unknowns that you run into on those foundations, so
Well,
that project doesn't come in. For example, so if you look at the numbers that they put together here, by far the biggest ones that go over are bridges. Well, take that into account, that because of the foundational efforts and so on and so forth, you take a certain amount of money and you throw it into contingency to cover those things, so that you don't necessarily have to overbid a project, but you do need to have money available to cover that. And maybe that's how you sell that part of it, because
but that's already being done. The state does have a percentage.
Sorry to cut everyone off here, but I think there's like having a deep conversation about bridge budgeting. I think we're going to miss the forest through the trees. And I think that there's some really important questions that I have, but I want to wait to hear the rest of the presentation to hear whether Tova is going to answer them. And my mind is going less to specifics and more to like structure and data. So I'm interested to hear what we have to say there. And then I'd love to hear more about bridge building, because I don't know anything about it.
Why don't we let's go on ahead on the slides, and we can come back to this and keep talking about it.
Tova, do you want to hit the data?
Yep, let's go to the next slide, Michaela. Thank you. So quick overview. From 2019 to 2023, we completed 325 construction projects. 25 of those were local system projects, so 300 of those were on the state highway system. And the map just sort of breaks down where those projects are located. Over $2 billion worth of projects delivered in that 4-year period. Next slide. This is sort of the first layer of breaking down that information. So breaking down of those projects, the types of projects. You can see over a fifth of those projects were bridge program projects. Those range from bridge deck repairs, rail repairs, and upgrades to bridge replacements. Paving is another fifth of the work. Plus or minus. Over half of our work is projects in the $1 million to $5 million range, and that's not construction costs, that's total project costs. So those are pretty small projects, accounting for over half of the projects we delivered in that period of time, which is good to know. You can see that only 1% of the projects fall into the category of $50 to $100 million and up, cost wise, total cost wise.
What is modernization, Tova? What does that mean?
Modernization projects are interchange, big interchange projects, generally new overpasses and on ramps, interchanges. We don't the modernization program has really been funded through I think like programs like House Bill 2017 or like sort of special programming. It's not part of the STIP, not part of the federal STIP programs.
Is this
Back in
part, could it be capacity improvements or increases,
Yep, could also be capacity increases.
standards, upgrades, those kinds of things?
Yep. And I should clarify the colors in the pie chart on the left don't correlate to the colors on the right in the bar graph. So don't try to jump there. But I think it's worth noting to some of the comments before that we're only like the breakdown of projects that were delivered 2019 to 2023. Very, very, very. I think there are 2 projects in that whole group that fall into the category of like $50 million and up. So we're really looking like it's really quite uncommon, or has been uncommon in the last over the last 5 years for us to be delivering projects of that scale, which is notable, I think, for a number of reasons, and that we can talk more about. But it certainly makes to the commissioner's comment about if 10% of the projects where we're off are all like large projects, then that's something we need to look at especially. And I think we can go down a rabbit hole of the data, or at least I have on many occasions over the last couple of months. And I think that we're going to spend more time looking at our data in moving forward. And so I appreciate everyone's feedback about what data you're interested in looking at and how we can dig into it.
What I'd like to see
Yep.
is take your portfolio breakdown by project cost and then show us of each of those categories where we were over budget and over time.
Like the types of projects?
No, like the percentage, like so of the,
I have a good way to show this.
Okay, good, because I'm struggling.
So I'm picturing a like a bell curve for each project type, and a percentage of sort of overspend on the y-axis, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And we've got Tova, I'm thinking of the scatter
Yep.
one. So I think this is good feedback though, because we honestly truncated what we put in front of the commission last week and then what we brought to you all today. And I think that was the right call given how deep this conversation is already going, but it's good feedback. I think in the interest of time, Commissioner Smith, I know you always like a fluid conversation. I think you're getting it today. So I think Tova, let's jump through the bridge and pavement stuff real quick, because I think that data is also informative.
Yep. So next slide, Michaela. And so to the point we're drilling down into like specific sets of data. So bridge projects, which represent 23% of the portfolio, we looked at on budget performance based on the initial budget at STIP adoption, which is the top line of that graph, the budget at 100% design, and then from contract award to contract completion. That's the second note, is contract completion. And so we can see that based on the budgets that we set in the initial, in the adopted STIP, we are only, we are delivering on budget, a third of the time. I mean, we're missing the mark on delivering on budget based on that initial budget. But as projects advance through design and we know more about what the project entails, we're getting we're doing better, right? The budget gets we keep adding money, to be honest. That has been our practice. We keep adding money to match the level of design. And once we get to contract award, we are able to deliver within 10% of that that contract award budget over 90% of the time. But the point is that that makes sense. We should be able to deliver that close once we're beyond 100% design, once we're under contract. Bridge projects range in size, this portfolio of bridge projects ranged from $750,000 to $50 million. $50 million project is a bridge replacement project. $750,000 project is probably a rail, bridge rail. replacement projects. So big range in the types of projects, and consequently a big range in the scope of risk that a project carries forward from design to completion. And so I think to the point made by Ms. Brownstein before, like if we were able to if we dig into the small projects versus the large projects, how far off were they at original STIP adoption? That'll, I think, certainly will help inform how we change our ways in terms of programming. So I see some questions.
And I don't know anything about bridge construction. I would defer to Ted on this, but I suspect that it would be more relevant to compare a $750,000 bridge project to a $750,000 like repaving project, and see how you're doing on sort of project size. I suspect you're going to see that you're much more accurate when it comes to smaller projects than you are to those larger projects. I don't know that for a fact, but I don't know that it doesn't feel relevant to me to compare a project that's $750,000 that's repaving a bridge or whatever to a project that's rebuilding a bridge and putting in pylons and everything that Ted talked about earlier.
Good. Paula?
Well, and I'm kind of picking up from there as well, but I like the looking at different space spots of where you are in your project development. At the initial budget, there's a lot of unknowns. But once you get a bid, tracking what's changed between the bid, like Ted said, they're going to build it for what they bid, unless there's some unforeseen conditions and change orders, etc. So then that second and third bar is really, I think, the most interesting, and understanding what the change orders are, what you found, and analyzing whether it's a foundations problem that you're not designing the risk enough, accommodating risk on, or whether there's something else in the makeup of a bridge construction that you're just not hitting the mark. So I like where you're going. I think it's going to be interesting as you follow and really look at those change orders within those projects to see what's costing more.
Appreciate that, Paula. I think one of the things I just mentioned to this group, I think, Shanna, you put this in the chat very early on. Do we have different risk factors for different kinds and sizes of projects? And frankly, we do, and we look at the design, but we're not carrying a different contingency amount, or we're not carrying, and I think Tobin mentioned this earlier, we're not carrying risk based on those project sizes in a different way. It's kind of the one size fits all approach. That's certainly what's come out through this review, is we've got to take a different approach to that. In the interest of time, Tova, I think we've got the payments.
The next slide.
Yeah, I think we've got the payments data in there. Maybe hit that super quick and then get to the inflation thing. And then I'd like to maybe pivot to CIAC role.
Yep. And this is, so like this slide is similar breakdown for paving program. I think somewhat different factors in terms of like unknowns and things that come up during construction. I think we do a better job once we're in construction to manage, to deliver projects on budget, which I think I would say the risks that we carry into construction for paving projects are substantially smaller and very different than the kinds of risks that we carry on a bridge project. My inclination is to go on to the next slide right now, unless there are specific questions about paving. All right, looks like getting some nods. So wanted to just share this plot of the National Highway Construction Cost Index from 2017 to the present, what we've seen the construction market costs do over these years. It's notable. We have a lot of conversations about how our historic inflation has impacted projects and delivery of projects and project costs, frankly. And I just want to note, that is one factor in the conversations that we're having. It's not the only factor. I think that part of what we've done over since 2019 is improve a lot of our the tools we have to capture inflation in our programming and cost estimating, and still I don't think we like our cost estimates for the 21-24 step and the 20 and for the 21-24 step in particular, like really didn't account for what became like historic inflation. So just as a note, like when we look at like these 2019 to 2023 projects, these projects were estimated in 2019, and they were like design initiated in like late 2020 and early 2021, and then construction bidding happened, really started in earnest in 2022 and then 2023. And so we've seen a huge increase in construction costs just in that time between when we adopted that STIP and when we put projects out to construction. And so that has been a factor in project costs increasing over the from STIP adoption through construction completion. Go to the next slide here. So I want to acknowledge that like there are a lot of things that contribute to like why projects increase, like what project costs increases from STIP adoption to project construction. Some of those things, some of the reasons they increase are, I'm going to say, are opportunities that we as an agency are taking advantage of, to deliver more comprehensive projects for communities. And those are things that come, like in many cases, scope and funding that comes up during project design, partnerships with local agencies, opportunities to bundle projects, things like that, where we really want to take advantage of, we're going to be out at this one location, maybe for the, this upcoming time, and we want to do as much in the community as possible as part of a project. And like that sometimes plays out in the form of adding scope and adding funds, like after STIP adoption. Also, there are unanticipated conditions that occur, unanticipated conditions that are encountered during design through field investigation, that aren't accounted for, regulatory changes, market conditions, as I mentioned before. My angle on this is to say these are all things that certainly happen during during the delivery of projects. And we know that these kinds of things come up during projects, and the contingencies that we use, like when we're programming and adopting a STIP, don't adequately address all of those things. And I think that we need to, one of our observations is that we need to be knowing that opportunities are going to come up, and things are there are going to be regulatory changes, there are going to be unanticipated conditions, and we should be more thoughtful about accounting for them in our programming to begin with. And on that note, Mac, I think you're going to share some observations about.
Let's get to Mayor Cross and then
Yep.
Commissioner Smith, if that works for you all, work to maybe land this here in a few minutes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we are kind of pushing our time limit, so
Yep.
Let's
Ignore my hand.
No,
I thought there was a button for thumbs up, and there wasn't. So
no.
I think if we can try and wrap it up in the next 5 minutes, and if we need to come back for further dialogue, we can.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Commissioner Smith. And I think just real quick as we move away from this slide, if I'm reflecting on the last 4 years, if we had the exact same situation play out in terms of market costs in the next 4 years, what I'm looking for is how are we telling the public, telling you all, doing a better job of saying these are the realities that we're facing, and we're going to have to adjust our portfolio of projects. In some respects, and I've made this comment multiple times, we sort of hid that reality. Everybody knew it was happening, but we really took it as a project by project conversation of, hey, this project's coming in over, or we need more money to take this project to construction, instead of stepping back and saying, here's how this market volatility is impacting our entire portfolio. So somewhere out of this work, I want to get to, if we had this all over again, how would we be handling this conversation differently? And I think we have the opportunity to get in front of that conversation a bit to make it less, I think to Mayor Cross's point, to make it less of a trust issue and more of a, here's the reality. And to Tova's point, we know some of these things are going to occur and we need to account for them, but how do we build a better mechanism to convey what's going on across the whole of the portfolio? So if we could go to slide 17, Michaela, I'll work to land this real quick. So in your file, in your notes for today, your materials, you've got all of these slides, but I just wanted to land, we've been talking a lot about work we need to do. And so we've already set ourselves down a path of course correcting, making some improvements. So we've got a bunch of stuff on the left in terms of what we're working on to not do this again in the same way. So we're building the next step as we speak. So how do we not take the same approach? And then on the right, where are we getting some additional feedback and input into this? So we're initiating a review of our bridge program with FHWA, and then we're also anticipating an external review of our project delivery processes. So how are we learning from others beyond the folks we've already been talking to? And then I think to Commissioner Smith, to your point, I do see a follow-up conversation at the right time with this group, and maybe less of a follow-up and more of a ongoing, how are we bringing information to this group of the health of our portfolio. So Michaela, if you go to the last slide, or excuse me, slide 18. And I think today, I know we're running a little short, but I think any feedback from this group either today or in the future around mechanisms or ways that we can bring kind of what's going on with our portfolio. I think certainly the dashboard conversation that we had last time feeds into this. But then how are we talking about risks to the delivery of our portfolio over the long term as we consider the health of what we're trying to deliver? So with that, I'd probably close there. Commissioner Smith, turn it over to you for any other comments or points before we switch the agenda.
Yeah, I just, one of my preliminary thoughts is that we all, during the last 4 years, saw inflation and project costs, and it was all, we all kind of talked about it on an anecdotal basis, but we never really took a big picture and said, as an organization, we don't see this trend stopping for the foreseeable future. We didn't look far enough ahead. We didn't like identify the problem soon enough and bring it to kind of the attention of the OTC and the, you know, administration, for lack of a better word. I mean, the directors and deputy directors didn't sit down, as far as I know, and say, hey, this is happening. We've got to figure out what we're going to do because we're going to run out of money. And maybe it did happen, but it didn't happen in a way that was raised to the level of bringing it to the commission, of my recollection. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
I
think
you're right, but I think, you know, if you go back to Abernathy Bridge, when we were walking through that and I asked the question, what are you putting in there for increase? And they said 3.5%. And I said, you're crazy. You know, you're going to be way out. And they assured me, oh, Ted, we've covered everything. We've looked at it. And from the state's estimate to the contractor's estimate was was around $80 million. So I mean, that's a big jump, but I think people are kind of telling management what they want to hear. A lot of it. They're not, I mean, we knew what the inflation was going up in the industry because we talked to everybody every day. Pricing is going crazy. So 3.5%, that was something we'd used years ago. And I think that was just kind of a push.
Yeah, and I think Commissioner Smith, to your point and to Ted's point, I think we had some specific conversations about individual projects, but to your point, that's exactly where my head goes in terms of learning from the past and how do we not replicate it again, do it again in the future. It's so how are we looking out far enough? We also had a step transition in the middle of that, which always disrupts our business for a reason that Tova and I've talked about. How do we not let it disrupt our business in the way that it traditionally has? But I think you're on to the point though of how are we raising if we look out far enough, here are all the projects in our portfolio in the pipeline. How do we need to adjust our plan? Because the dollars don't add up to everything that we've got in the portfolio side. Well said.
Okay, Shanna, and then why don't we put this on the table for now, and I'll work with the team to see how we can bring this back to finish the conversation, because it feels like we have more work to do.
I just want to say, and you may have said this, I had to step away from my computer for a second, but it strikes me that you assemble your list of infrastructure projects that you need. And like when at a utility, they do that all the time. They know what the projects they need to do are, how big they are, and how long they might take, right? Broadly, like I'm talking back of the envelope stuff. But you assemble that, and then you can look at the data that you've gathered and see what the big drivers of cost overages are. And and if it's inflation, it's inflation. Like we don't have a crystal ball there. But like you can start to create a more accurate view of what things are going to cost into the future. And you can build those assumptions in and you can call them out. And then, to Rod's point, to Mayor Cross's point, sorry, Mayor Cross, uh, then you can more accurately tell the story of what you're trying to do and why you need this money. But to me, it's a combination of having a clear view of what projects you have coming down the pike. Maybe it's a 5-year horizon, maybe it's 10 years. Break those projects out into size and type, and then look back and see what the big drivers are and apply those to the future. And I'm always a little hesitant to apply to be reflective as we plan for the future, because things change, technology changes and things like that. But like at least then we can assign some different risk factors to different types of projects, different sizes of projects. And I think you're going to get a more accurate estimate of what things actually will cost if you do that.
Yeah. And one last thing I think we ought to put into the conversation hopper is we're starting to see a lot more non-traditional design bid build project delivery, and there's definitely some opportunities there to share risk when we do alternative delivery, CMGC, that kind of stuff. So put that on the hopper too.
Yeah, absolutely, Commissioner. It's certainly in the mix. Well, I appreciate the amount of time. I know we're a few minutes over. Commissioner, thanks for indulging us a little bit. I see there's a few things in the chat that I'll respond to as well. But Commissioner Sis, thanks for the time. I guess I'd turn it back to you.
Thank you. And I think we'll have you come back because we haven't finished the conversation. So. And thank you for your time. And Travis, I know you can be quick. And you're also muted.
Sorry, I was double muted. But yes, I am highly caffeinated, so I can be quick. So appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you today about some of our transportation funding challenges. This is going to be a little bit of a schizophrenic presentation in the sense that I am both going to be trying to convey some of the technical background about where we're at on transportation funding, what the challenges and opportunities are, and also try to tell the story in a way that hopefully is helpful. But I really do want your help in how can we better tell this story. And I will admit that as being a little bit on the technical side, sometimes I will verge toward that side of the discussion. So please rein me in where it is helpful and help us get to that more appropriate way of telling the story publicly. So I am going to figure out how to share this thing a minute and then start walking through here. All right. Do you see that effectively? Okay, good. So first off, Travis Brower, ODOT Assistant Director for Revenue Finance Compliance, the money guy, responsible for all of the divisions of ODOT that both take in the tax resources and also that budget and process the payment for our expenditures. So oversee significant part of the agency and really responsible for trying to keep our fiscal ship in order, which is becoming increasingly challenging, as you will see today. So I'm going to start really briefly with a real quick sort of transportation funding 101, just to give you a sense of how we get our money in the state of Oregon. At a very high level, there are three major categories of state and federal transportation funding that we rely on. The first and the largest is the State Highway Fund, which brings in about $1.7 billion a year. The second is federal highway funding, which is about $750 million a year. Both of these funding sources are distributed by different formulas in law between ODOT and local governments. State Highway Fund is, you'll typically hear 50, 30, 20. 50% ODOT, 30% to the counties, and 20% to the cities after taking the collection costs off the top. Federal highway funding is more about 70, 75% ODOT, 30% local governments, depending on the funding source within that. And I should note that the federal highway funds can generally only be used for capital expenditures, so construction projects. And that's going to be a key concept that we'll share a little bit later. Last but not least, there's about $300 million a year in federal and state public transportation funding. This has been going up in recent years as the legislature created the statewide transportation improvement fund, but you can see it's a fraction of what we spend on the highway side of the ledger. And in the past, this was even more so a local responsibility to pay for public transportation. On the State Highway Fund, as I noted, we get about $1.7 billion a year. We have a unique way of doing this in Oregon. It's really a very well-balanced three-legged stool that relies on the fuels tax, taxes on motor carrier, primarily the weight mile tax on heavy trucks, which charges motor carriers more for their disproportionate wear and tear on the system, and then the DMV. So you can see that the largest single source is the fuels tax at about 40% of the total taxes. It's also, the fuels tax is the largest source of funding at the federal level. So we in transportation are heavily dependent on the fuels tax. So that's your basic 101. And now I'm going to shift into some of the challenges that we face in transportation funding. So just to give you a sense, this is not a complete list, but it does give you a pretty good, somewhat comprehensive list. We see that the gas tax in particular is really starting to fall apart, with fuel efficiency of the fleet really diminishing the gas tax revenue that's coming in. Second is that inflation erodes almost all of our transportation revenue sources. Those two factors, plus the way the legislature has directed funding in the past, means that ODOT faces a massive shortfall for the day-to-day work of highway maintenance and operating the agency. That is really going to impair our ability to serve Oregonians effectively. Another challenge that we see now that is really emerged, and as we get past the peak of the HB 2017 funding, is that construction funding is now heading downhill. And so we're going to see less investment in the transportation system, not just on the maintenance side, but actually in construction. And then a growing emerging concern is that federal funding is at risk of deep cuts as we reach the midpoint of the federal infrastructure bill. So I'm going to walk through each of these in a little bit of depth, and please feel free to pepper me with questions or comments about some of this. So if there's one thing just to remember, is the gas tax is really, it's a wonderful tax in terms of how easy it is to collect, and yet it is a tax that is being hit by a 1-2 punch of inflation and fuel efficiency because the gas tax is set at a flat rate that in Oregon at least does not adjust with prices. So we'll start with fuel efficiency. We know that passenger vehicles in Oregon are becoming more fuel efficient. We've seen the fleet get about 25% more fuel efficient. So far, that's been a little bit because of battery electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, but a lot of it is just someone trading in a 1994 Subaru Outback that gets 20 miles a gallon for a 2020 Subaru Outback that gets more like 30 miles a gallon. So we're seeing this increase to date. There is open question about how fast this transition of the fleet will go forward. But the plan in Oregon is that by 2035, basically all new vehicles will have to be low emission, very fuel efficient vehicles, primarily electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid. So we are expecting that over time, the fleet will turn over. I do think there's an open question whether we'll go quite as fast, but we'll be watching this very carefully and adjusting our assumptions based on what we actually see in terms of fleet turnover. What that means is that we now have a fuel tax forecast where we're expecting that basically this year and this current calendar year is going to be the peak of the fuel tax, and it's all going to be downhill from here. The increases you've seen, from 2020 to 2024 are really because the rate of the fuel tax was going up. Under the transportation funding package passed by the legislature, HB 2017, there were 2-cent rate increases in 2020, 22, and 2024 that are now done. Those are played out. There are no more increases going forward. And as a result, we're going to see just nominal fuel tax revenue beginning to decline before you even adjust for inflation. So this is just in the actual dollars coming in the door.
Travis,
We already saw, yes.
does that downward trend assume the rate of EV adoption that your other slide showed, which
It
may or
does.
may not happen, but it's
Yep.
you have to tie it to something. Okay.
It does,
Yeah.
but if you go back to this slide, you can see, okay, so if you compare here, we're out to 2031. What you can see in this slide is most of the growth in EVs is going to be after the end of our revenue forecast.
Okay.
And so far, this trend line is being matched, at least until recently. I haven't gotten, an update, based on what Mayor Cross said earlier. We are seeing EV sales potentially flattening a bit, but to date, the trend line has actually matched our assumptions fairly well. And most of the growth is actually out in the out years beyond the forecast.
Okay.
So we are reasonably confident of at least the next several years on this chart. Mayor Cross, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what I said at the very top of our meeting here. I see your graph of where hybrids and plug-in hybrids are going. I think in this state, though, things aren't going to be that, for lack of a better word, rosy toward people going to the all-electric. And it's simply because of range. For example, a friend of mine lives in Fossil. Well, if they've got to go to Bend, they're screwed, because unless they can, possibly get in one of the few fast charging stations, they're stuck there for 6 hours while they wait for their car to charge. I don't know, to be blunt, I don't know if people's habits will change enough to accommodate at least the current infrastructure for charging vehicles.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Mayor Cross. And I can say that as someone who owns both a hybrid and an EV. I drove my hybrid to Fossil last year. And fun story, there is actually a level 2 charging station in downtown Fossil, right by the place where you go behind the high school to dig fossils. So it's true, though, the infrastructure is limited. I think we are going to see probably a lot more either hybrid electric or hybrids coming online, because there is a limit. I mean, the newer batteries are lasting much longer distances, but there still is a limit to what people can get out of those.
Yeah, I love my hybrid. Don't get me wrong. I don't have a plug-in hybrid. I have a for lack of a better word, normal hybrid. I love it. But the reason I went with it was simply because I like to travel, and it makes, charging becomes a issue.
You're going to be happy to
And you
know,
can imagine, though,
Rod, that we're going to talk about electrification at an upcoming meeting. So let's maybe move along.
So the reality is, even if we move toward mainly hybrids, we're going to see dramatic reduction, because if you go from a 25 mpg sedan to a 48 mpg hybrid sedan, you're going to be seeing, the reduction in revenue of about half. Jonathan.
Hi, unsurprisingly, I have something to say about this. Yeah, don't plan on the motor fuels tax anymore. Like, figure out a road use fee that gets allocated when vehicles go through their DEQ check, whatever it is, or a small fee. I will absolutely deny having said this if you attribute it to me to any like EV industry people, but like there's no reason why you can't apply some sort of road use fee at charging stations. So I think that that's the future and that's what you should be doing. I don't know what the amount should be. I'm also from the East Coast. Tolls are great. I know that they're like radioactive here, but I think we should be tolling our roadways. I think people who are using the roads pay for the roads. So anyway, those are the few things I want to say. But I think, you know, the takeaway from this is like, don't depend on the fuels tax anymore.
So Shauna, can you call the governor, please?
I cannot.
Okay, because
And-
she just decided that we had to pause tolling
Oh,
last
yeah,
week.
there's that.
And Shauna,
He's from the East Coast too.
please explain to people who live in rural areas who have to drive a hell of a lot more than people who live in cities about how I have to pay more than the person who lives in the city.
You
Oh,
use
we'll
the
get to
roads
that.
more.
We'll get to that. We'll get to
Okay,
that
just
next
be
time.
thinking about that.
I
Yeah.
am thinking about it.
Yeah, and Mayor Cross, I won't go into detail, but you're already paying more, and you probably will pay less more under a road usage charge than people in urban areas. All of us Prius driving hippies in urban areas are the ones who might pay a little bit more. All right,
As you
so that's that's fuel efficiency for you. The first punch that's coming in, and as Shauna noted, making the gas tax just completely unreliable and something we can't rely on in the future. The other is inflation. You already saw this chart. I didn't know they were going to use it. Although I will note that my chart does do what Paula asked. It shows the increase over time on the left side. So we have seen that nationwide highway construction costs have increased by more than 80% since the beginning of 2017. I went back then because that's when the legislature passed HB 2017. It was a 40% increase in the state highway fund, and our project costs have increased by 80%. So even with a historic funding package, we're actually falling further behind in what we can buy with that funding stream.
Travis, I'm going to look
So
for a
that's-
different chart that refutes that. So I'm a little concerned about this 80% number because that isn't what we're
Okay.
seeing at the national ARTBA level. So
interesting.
I just if this might be on certain materials, and that's how CCI is put together, but total construction costs, I don't know. I'm just questioning it because I'm shocked by that large percentage increase.
Yeah, if you have anything, Paula, that would show a different number. I mean, I know there's a couple different indexes. We use another one. In fact, one of my future charts will use a slightly different index that's a little bit more expansive.
Yeah.
This is what Federal Highways puts out, and I think it does have both supplies and contract work.
Okay.
So I've been very interested to find out what
Yeah,
you think.
I'll
'Cause if
just
we're
look.
using a number that's,
I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like, well, I don't know. We'll see.
yeah, no, that'd be really helpful,
Okay.
actually.
I'll do some
If we're
research.
misusing data, we want to know that.
Or at least characterize exactly what
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
Exactly. So overall, when you look at the state highway fund with the multiple funding sources, with fuels tax declining, our other revenue sources are increasing just slightly. You can see that the total gross revenue in the state highway fund is basically going to be flat. It's going to grow at less than 0.5% per year. When you adjust for inflation going forward, you see a dramatic drop off. And you see that the state highway fund is past its peak in inflation adjusted terms from several years ago. So we are already on the other side of the downhill curve with the total state highway fund, unless there's additional revenue that is coming in. Because we're just not going to have that organic natural growth in revenue coming in. So all of that is bad. And then when you look at what it means for ODOT's budget, it gets worse. And that's because ODOT generally has two budgets. We have two sides of the budget. And I always say that it's a lot like the opening line of A Tale of Two Cities from Charles Dickens. On the transportation projects and program side, it's been the best of times. We've had record investments at the state and federal level in those dedicated funds for construction projects and grant programs. On the other hand, on the maintenance and agency operations side, it's the worst of times. because the state highway fund dollars that are available to run the agency for things like road maintenance, the DMV and our Commerce Compliance Division, which regulates and taxes heavy trucks, as well as the central services like IT and HR, and even the indirect costs of project delivery, that money available to operate the agency has been flat or declining over the course of a number of years. And people always say, well, how can that be? There's been a lot more money that's come in from transportation funding packages. So we put together this chart, we call it the river chart, that shows how money flows in on the left from the three sources I shared earlier, and then where the money goes on the right. What you can see is that we have a lot of money that comes off the top for things like collection costs at DMV. Local governments receive over $600 million a year in apportionments. And then on the ODOT side, the majority of funds goes into debt service and capital programs that have been directed by the legislature. What's left is the available money for operations and maintenance, which also has to cover other functions like paying for match of federal funds and a wide variety of other programs. This number, the 370 million, has been basically flat for about 20 years because of the way the legislature has pretty much put all of the new money into local apportionments and projects, the debt service and capital programs within ODOT's budget. So one of those areas is, debt service. So I always like to share our debt service chart. We have a reasonable amount of debt service that we pay every year. It's a little over $200 million a year. It's going to go up a little bit after we sell our last tranche of bonds that have been authorized, but it's grown immensely. And so basically, about 1 in 3 of ODOT's dollars goes out the door on day one to pay for projects that are largely already completed. So that constrains what we have for O&M and for new projects as well. Another way to look at this is just how the legislature allocates funding. In HB 2017, they provided nearly 2/3 of $1 billion in annual revenue for all modes of transportation. What you can see is about 1/3 of that went to cities and counties. About 1/3 of that went to the projects within ODOT for safety, bridges, pavement, the debt service on the bonded projects that they named, and the urban mobility strategy projects like the Rose Corridor and I-205. And then about 1/4 of the money went to transit. Of the total amount that came in under this package, less than 2% is available for ODOT to do to the day-to-day maintenance and operations. That didn't even allow us to keep up with inflation, not even close, because it was such a small amount of additional money that was allowed. On the other hand, cities and counties are allowed and largely do use their money for maintenance and operations. So we have the situation in ODOT where we just don't have enough money to do the day-to-day maintenance and operations of the system and the agency. What we're seeing is, our budget was largely in balance. This is the operations and maintenance side of our budget. The revenue, did go up a little bit. Some of this is actually because of wildfire costs that are reimbursed by the federal government back in the 1921 biennium. But our operating expenditures have grown significantly. We've reined those in by making budget cuts that I'll talk about in a moment. But over time, as you'd expect, the cost of operating the agency will go up with the just normal inflation. But the revenue we have available, net of our collection costs and all the other stuff that goes out the door for debt service and whatnot, is actually going to go down. And this is not inflation adjusted. This is just nominal dollars. So you can see that gap that we've opened up in the last couple of years is going to become very large in 25, 27, and then just massive in the years to come. So we need to find some way to close this gap, or we're going to make even deeper budget reductions than we've already made within the agency. So we've already taken a lot of steps to do what we can on our own to address this. We have shifted as much of our operations and maintenance costs to some of those dedicated funds. You can do just a little bit of use of federal funds for O&M. We've used some of our HB 2017 funds for O&M, but those opportunities are just, we can't find anything else really. We have gotten some additional revenue for O&M functions when the legislature passed the DMVC bill, and then we have taken budget reductions. To date, that's about 10% across our O&M functions in 2 steps of 5% each in last biennium and the biennium before. So we have already taken those reductions and generally found efficiencies and ways to save money, reducing our facilities footprint, holding positions vacant longer, and doing some of those things that have really minimized what the customer impact will be. But going forward, there will be significant impacts if we have to continue down this path. Donna.
This isn't specifically an O&M question, but have you guys gone after any federal funds for, like, through grants or things like that that would help if we would ameliorate this gap?
So we go for federal grants all the time. In fact, I think we've got something like 6 federal grant requests that we're working on. We just got a $450 million grant for the Rose Quarter. However, so those grants are exclusively used for construction projects. So while they certainly help with investments in the transportation system, they don't really help us with this O&M gap that we have going forward.
You're not allowed to use like some percentage of the overall funds towards like back office support or anything?
You can use it for the direct costs of project delivery. You cannot use it for the indirect cost of project delivery. So I know that a lot of grants that we give to, say, universities, they'll often take 30%, total cut. We can only use literally the direct. You can charge your specific time spent on a project to that grant, but not your general O&M overhead costs. So unfortunately, those don't really help that much.
Okay, thanks.
But we always take them. I mean, because it's better to get the investment of free federal dollars.
Hey, Travis, could you speak to Mayor Cross's comment in the chat about local governments and their share?
Yeah, sorry, I just saw that. Local governments get a share of the total state highway fund based on what's in statute. And we always say 50-30-20, but it's actually a blended rate of a bunch of different funded packages. It started 60-40, it's now 50-30-20 with new money. So the blend is about 55% comes to ODOT, 45% goes to local governments. Local governments also raised some of their own money. So for example, there are 3 local counties that have registration fees in the Portland metro region. There are a couple dozen cities.
I just thought it applied to the gas tax. That's all. And I was looking at your numbers and it didn't max. So thank you. That's all I need to know. Thanks, Travis.
Got it. Sorry. I didn't understand the question. So my apologies.
That's okay.
It's of the total state highway fund. Yep. So let me turn now. We just talked about O&M. Let me talk about the construction side. This is what we call our mountain chart because it looks like a mountain range. And what we saw was we had major investments back in the early 2000s from the Oregon Transportation Investment Act, or OTIA programs, the Recovery Act, and then the Jobs and Transportation Act, and then an increase in federal funds, which is the sort of base step from the infrastructure bill, as well as funding from HB 2017, the HB 2017 projects and the UMS projects. We're now at the peak of that second mountain there, which is lower than where we were 20 years ago. But we're about to go down the other side, other than the interstate bridge. That's because we're starting to finish off some of those projects that were funded out of HB 2017. And we see our funding sources being eroded by inflation going forward. So the same situation we face on the O&M side is now going to hit us on the construction side as well. One of the major considerations in that is federal funding. Some of you may be aware the federal government has not increased the gas tax since 1993. It's at 18.4 cents per gallon. As a result, the funding flowing into the Federal Highway Trust Fund is basically flat, and it's about $40 billion a year. The money flowing out, though, is more like $80 billion a year at the peak, at the end of the infrastructure bill. You can see that that orange line going up significantly, starting with the infrastructure bill in 2023. When that bill is done, Congress is going to have a $40 billion a year annual revenue gap between what's coming in and what's going out of the revenue of the Highway Trust Fund. And as a result, we are very concerned about what could happen with federal funding. Federal funding could fall by about half if Congress does not continue general fund transfers. And I don't know about you, but when I look at this Congress, I'm a little concerned about their ability to function effectively and come up with the revenue needed.
Here, Travis,
So
why do you feel that way?
I was telling somebody earlier today that I think if anybody introduced a resolution to acknowledge that the sky is blue, they probably couldn't even get the votes to pass that.
No, they would argue over what that color is.
So, that's the challenge side. Where we see the opportunity is for really shifting to a more diversified revenue portfolio. We need sufficient and sustainable, reliable funding to maintain and modernize the transportation system. And we're going to need to go beyond those three workhorses that we've used in the past. We need to look at indexing taxes and fees to inflation. The majority of people in the US now live in a state where the gas tax, for example, is increased by inflation or some other measure over time. We need to look at shifting to charging by the mile or with a road usage charge. We need to look at tolling and EV registration fees and general fund sources as ways to supplement this and not put all of our eggs in the baskets that we have today. So I will stop there given our time constraints and happy to answer any more questions or take your comments.
I'm trying to figure out how to raise my hand. I think this is interesting, and one side of the story, what it doesn't even touch is that not only do you don't have the money, but you're under investing in what's really needed for preservation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, once you stack up the needs and a strategy for investing in those needs against this pitiful revenue forecast, then you have a compelling story that you can take to the legislature with a little more certainty about what could be.
And
that's a really good point. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to reiterate, this is something that cities have been dealing with for at least 30 years. Mm-hmm. And because we can't raise half the taxes that anybody else can, we end up having roads that go a lot longer than they should have gone without getting maintenance done on them. So I think one of the things that any way you build into this, if you can get cities on board to back whatever it is you're doing, because it'll help them too, I think the legislature will have to listen at that point because they live in those same places. When you said the number for the federal gas tax, I about died. It's like, you've got to be kidding me. That's not even pennies. That's half a penny.
And that has been eaten up by inflation long ago.
So just a couple thoughts, Travis, as I think about like this huge task you have in front of you. In my mind, like the way I would go about this is I would determine, and you've done this, like what the different funding options are, right? And you want to diversify it as much as possible so that in the future you're sustainable if one of those streams goes away. And then you need to figure out how you're going to communicate that to federal lawmakers and state lawmakers. And I think to Mayor Cross's point, like, to me, the most compelling communication method is just pictures. Look, we all drive and we all hit potholes. We all are frustrated when roads aren't cleared after a big snowstorm. We're all, like, these are the things that, and really paint this picture. Like, this is where Oregon is headed. This is where our roads are headed if we don't have the bare minimum, which is X. And we won't be able to invest in future infrastructure, like Paula was just mentioning, if we don't have Y. And really, like, I mean, I would distill it down to like 6 bullets. Here's the problem. Like, here's what's going to happen if we don't do anything. Here's what we want you to do.
Yeah.
Another
good
point,
comment. And we did not talk about need today and the consequences. This is more on the technical funding side, but I think you need to bring those two pieces together.
Yeah.
what the investment needs are, what the funding you can do, and then what happens when you underinvest.
Well,
And I think that's a more compelling approach.
I think it's also really important for people to understand that the decisions we make today have serious ramifications in the future, but maybe not for 30 years. And so a good example of this, because I come out of the utility background, is Pacific Gas and Electric, like 35 years ago, cut their maintenance budget because they wanted to have better dividends for shareholders. So it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. 30 years later, there's a massive forest fire. And you could imagine that happening on the transportation side, like a bridge falls down. Like we've seen that happen across the country. So like, I think it's really important not to be a catastrophizer, but like really to say like, these decisions matter. They matter today. Like we have to be investing in our infrastructure today.
So for this state, one of the things that you have to point out to people is that our population has doubled since 1996. Okay. We were at 2.1 million people in 96 and we're at 4.15 now. Okay. Figure it out. We have not invested enough to keep up with that growth, let alone maintain what we've got, but without having to, do that investment into that infrastructure. We got to find some way to make sure people understand that part of it, that this isn't the same transportation system that was needed when you were going to college or whatever. This is a whole new ball game because of the amount of people we have to deal with now. That's why the interstate bridge is so vital to getting it done. And we've got to figure out how to fix that problem. And that didn't please me when the governor said what she said, but I get it. But you got to leave some of that on the table.
Well, we're out of time and money, so there's that. Again, I think we have a lot maybe unfinished on this topic that we'll figure out a way to circle back and have the robust conversation. I think we've got some great suggestions. Rod, the pointing out that the population has doubled is a piece that we haven't thought of before, to my knowledge. And I agree with you, Shauna, that we need to add pictures to the numbers because that's what people are going to respond to. And to Paula's comment, this doesn't even touch on the fact that at the bridge replacement we're going to get to all the bridge needs in 900 years with current funding. So yeah, trying to weave all of those stories into one is the challenge. Leah,
I really appreciate everyone sharing this stuff. This is really good work and it's sobering and important.
Yeah, thank you. Leah, did you have anything you wanted to do for wrap up?
I think the main thing that I had, Commissioner Smith, was just to bring back the project delivery conversation. And then I think we'll look at some modifications to how we're kind of merging the funding topics all together and bring that back. And then I just want to point out that what Amanda put in the chat, right? A lot of this is also helpful feedback for us to hear as we're continuing to develop that dashboard, which we're closer and closer to every day, but incorporating pieces of these to tell the whole story. So I just appreciate that. And that'll be the work that we work on through the kind of my wrap up.
Thanks. Oh, and one last thing, in the invite, there's a link to a video that we didn't have time to play today. But if you have a chance, it's only about 5 minutes long. It really tells a very good story in a video way that I think has to be part of our messaging. And so I commend you to take a look at it if you have time. And thank you. We will see you in May.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.